You know that feeling when you walk away from a conversation and hours later, you're still thinking about it. Not because anything dramatic happened. You just remember the way you answered, the expression on their face, the pause before they responded. Maybe you wonder whether you said too much, or not enough, whether they misunderstood you, whether you misunderstood them. And sometimes it isn't even about other people. You can be sitting alone, doing absolutely nothing, and suddenly become aware of yourself, thinking, aware of your mood, aware of your breathing, aware of the fact that you're aware. It can feel like there's a quiet observer inside you, watching your own life as it happens. And the strange part is that other people may not understand it at all. They might call you an overthinker, too sensitive, too serious, someone who analyzes everything, someone who needs to just let things go. But what they see as overthinking may feel very different from the inside. Because for some people, thinking isn't simply something they do. It is the way they make sense of the world. And this is where the idea of being too conscious becomes interesting. Because there are people who seem unusually aware of themselves, their emotions, their surroundings, other people's reactions, and even the meaning behind ordinary experiences. They notice things, small changes in someone's tone, a different expression, the atmosphere in a room, the feeling underneath someone's words, their own emotional shifts. And sometimes they notice themselves noticing all of it. Psychology has a word for part of this, metacognition. It is essentially the ability to think about your own thinking. You don't simply experience an emotion. You can step back and ask, why am I feeling this? You don't simply have a thought. You notice where the thought came from. You don't simply enter a relationship. You start noticing the patterns inside it. And that kind of awareness can be incredibly useful. But awareness has an interesting paradox. The more information your mind can notice, the more information it has to process. Research on rumination and self-focused attention has shown that repeatedly turning inward can sometimes make emotional experiences feel more intense rather than resolving them. And neuroscience gives us another piece of the puzzle. The brain is constantly trying to predict what is happening next. It compares what is happening now with what it has learned from the past. So when someone has become highly attentive to subtle changes in their environment, their brain may become exceptionally good at detecting them. A slightly different tone can register. A delayed reply can register. A change in someone's behavior can register. The mind doesn't necessarily say, something is wrong. It simply says, something changed. And for a highly self-aware person, that small signal can become the beginning of an entire internal conversation. What changed? Why did it change? Did I cause it? Is something happening that I haven't understood yet? This is where consciousness can quietly become exhausting. Not because the person is weak, but because their attention rarely feels completely off. And sometimes this way of being begins much earlier than adulthood. A child who grows up in an unpredictable environment may become very attentive to the emotional atmosphere around them. They learn to notice whether someone is angry before the anger is expressed. They notice footsteps, voices, silences, facial expressions. They learn, sometimes without realizing it, that understanding what is happening around them can make the world feel safer. Other children may learn primarily by being told what is happening. Some children learn by watching. Neither is inherently better, but repeated experience shapes attention. A nervous system adapts to the environment it encounters. If paying attention helped you navigate uncertainty, paying attention can become automatic. And eventually the skill can follow you into environments where it is no longer necessary. You may become an adult who can read a room almost instantly. You may understand people unusually well. You may anticipate problems before they happen. You may notice emotional shifts that other people completely miss, but there can be a quiet cost. You can become so accustomed to monitoring the world that simply existing without analyzing it starts to feel unfamiliar. And this is the part people often misunderstand. This isn't necessarily anxiety. It isn't necessarily trauma. It isn't necessarily some superior level of intelligence or emotional depth either. People are wired differently. Some people naturally process experience outwardly. They talk, act, experience, and move forward. Others process experience inwardly. They observe, reflect, connect patterns, and make meaning. Neither is better. Neither is more evolved. Neither is automatically healthier. The difference is often simply in where attention naturally goes. And perhaps the most surprising part is that the same awareness that makes someone exhausted can also make them remarkably perceptive. They may notice when a friend isn't themselves. They may recognize patterns in relationships. They may question assumptions that everyone else accepts. They may be unusually reflective about their own behavior. They may catch themselves repeating something they learned in childhood and think, wait, why am I doing this? That moment is powerful. Because consciousness doesn't only create the ability to observe yourself. It creates the possibility of changing what you observe. But there is another paradox here. Sometimes the person who understands themselves the most can also struggle to simply be themselves. Because when you're constantly observing yourself, even ordinary experiences can become performances. You aren't just laughing. Part of you is noticing how you're laughing. You aren't just talking. Part of you is evaluating what you're saying. You aren't just living. Part of you is watching yourself live. And eventually, you can become so familiar with the observer that you forget what it feels like to simply participate in the moment. That doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means awareness has become very practiced. And practiced attention can become a habit. The beautiful thing is that habits aren't identities. You are not required to become less intelligent, less perceptive, or less reflective in order to feel more at ease. The goal isn't to destroy the observer inside you. It is simply to recognize that the observer doesn't have to comment on everything. Sometimes a thought can remain a thought. Sometimes another person's silence can simply be silence. Sometimes an emotion can exist without immediately needing an explanation. And sometimes life doesn't need to be understood before it can be experienced. If you've spent years wondering why you notice so much, why you think so deeply about ordinary moments, or why your mind seems to keep observing itself even when nothing is wrong, there may be a much gentler explanation than the ones you've been given. You may have simply developed a mind that became very good at paying attention. And somewhere along the way, that attention became part of how you learned to move through the world. There's nothing inherently broken about that. There's something deeply human about it. Because perhaps the real challenge for people who are highly conscious isn't learning how to understand themselves better. Perhaps it's learning that they don't have to understand every moment in order to be present for it. And if that feeling of constantly watching yourself has ever made you wonder what else might be happening beneath the surface, there's another part of this story worth exploring. Why some people spend so much of their lives observing themselves from the outside, rather than feeling fully inside their own lives. Sometimes the way we experience ourselves has a history. And once you understand that history, certain things about you begin to make a little more sense.